The cemetery stood in silence, its wide pathways lined with tall trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The air carried a sense of calmness, almost like the whole place was whispering the stories of those who lay at rest beneath the ground. In this peaceful place, Marcus walked with slow, steady steps. His uniform was neat, his posture upright, and his eyes sharp, scanning the rows of tombs that stretched out in every direction. He was not just a guard, he was the keeper of memory, the one who carried the responsibility of protecting the resting place of fallen soldiers. Marcus had been working there for years, but every single day he entered the cemetery, he felt the same quiet respect that filled his heart on his very first day. To him, this was not just a job where he checked in and out. This was his duty, one that connected him deeply to his family history. His grandfather, a man he never met but often heard about in stories, had once worn a soldier's uniform and had given years of his life to serve his country. When Marcus stood among the tombs, he sometimes imagined his grandfather's voice reminding him that true honor lived not in medals or parades, but in the quiet remembrance of sacrifice. That evening, as the sun lowered itself in the sky and painted the clouds orange and pink, Marcus stopped at one particular tomb. He placed his hand gently on the cool stone, brushing away a few fallen leaves that the wind had carried. The name carved into it belonged to a soldier who had passed away decades ago, yet his story still carried weight. Marcus had read about him in old records kept at the cemetery office. He knew the details of the soldier's bravery, the way he had faced danger without fear, and how his service had left behind a mark that would never be forgotten. Moments like these always reminded Marcus why his role mattered so much. He had seen tourists pass by quickly, snapping pictures without truly paying attention. He had also seen families arrive with tears in their eyes, carrying flowers and prayers. Some stayed for only a few minutes, while others sat quietly for hours, remembering their loved ones. Marcus never judged anyone for the time they spent, but he always believed that every visitor should treat the cemetery with the respect it deserved. After all, this was not just land with stones and names, it was sacred ground where the stories of sacrifice rested. As he continued his walk, Marcus thought back to his own journey. Life had not always been easy for him. Growing up, he had faced his share of challenges. But his parents had taught him values that never left his side: discipline, kindness, and respect for those who came before him. These values shaped the man he became and guided him when he applied for the position of cemetery guard. At first, some people had asked him why he wanted such a quiet, unseen role. To them, it did not seem like a job worth holding. But Marcus knew better. He understood that sometimes the most meaningful responsibilities were the ones that went unnoticed by the world. He accepted his position with pride and had never looked back since. The day-to-day duties of guarding the cemetery were simple and routine but heavy in purpose. Marcus walked the grounds, checked the fences, ensured no damage had been done, and kept an eye on visitors. Sometimes, school groups came with teachers, and Marcus would share a few words about the importance of honoring the past. Other times, veterans would stop by, their steps slow but steady, and Marcus would quietly salute them, knowing they carried memories he could never fully understand. He believed his presence brought comfort, even when he said nothing at all. That evening, the calmness of the cemetery was so deep that Marcus could hear the distant sound of birds settling into the trees. He paused for a moment, breathing in the fresh air. The world outside the cemetery was noisy and fast, filled with people rushing about, caught up in their daily troubles. But inside the gates, time seemed to slow down, as though reminding everyone who entered that life was precious and short. Marcus often thought about how many stories were buried beneath the ground he guarded. Each stone carried a name, but behind those names were lives filled with dreams, fears, friendships, and sacrifices. Some were young men who had barely stepped into adulthood when they gave their lives. Others were older, experienced soldiers who had carried the weight of battles on their shoulders. Every tomb carried not just history, but humanity. Standing there, Marcus sometimes wondered what the soldiers would think if they could see the world today. Would they feel proud of how people remembered them? Would they feel respected? These questions stayed with him, pushing him to carry out his duties with more seriousness than ever. He often reminded himself that though the soldiers could no longer speak, their stones spoke for them. And it was his responsibility to make sure those voices were never drowned out by carelessness or disrespect. The respect Marcus had for his work was not something he forced. It came naturally to him because of the kind of man he was. People who knew him outside the cemetery often said Marcus carried himself differently. He was calm, thoughtful, and had a presence that made others quiet down when he spoke. His friends joked that it was because he spent so much time among the tombs, but Marcus knew it was something deeper. Watching over the dead had taught him lessons about life. It had shown him the fragility of time and the importance of living with dignity. That evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, Marcus made his final round across the grounds. He checked every corner carefully, ensuring everything was in order. He never rushed this routine, even though he had walked the same paths countless times. To him, every round was like a promise renewed, a promise to his grandfather, to the soldiers, and to himself. The promise was simple: as long as he stood watch, no harm would come to this place of honor. As he finished his patrol, Marcus paused once more by the main gate. He stood tall, his hands folded neatly in front of him, and looked back across the cemetery. The rows of stones stretched endlessly, glowing faintly in the moonlight. A quiet strength filled his heart as he whispered softly to himself, "Rest easy. I've got you." Marcus did not know that soon his calm evenings would be disrupted by something unexpected. He had no idea that his patience and discipline would soon be tested in a way that would make others notice the strength he carried silently every day. But for now, in the quiet of that evening, he was simply a guard, a man who stood between respect and carelessness, honor and mockery. He was a watchful presence, the protector of memory, and the silent reminder that sacrifice should never be forgotten. The next morning arrived bright and clear, with sunlight streaming down across the rows of tombstones. The cemetery looked peaceful, as it often did in the early hours, when only the sound of birds filled the air. Marcus began his daily routine with the same quiet dedication he always showed. He checked the gates, walked slowly along the paths, and stopped at several tombs to clear away leaves and dust. For him, these small acts were not chores, they were gestures of respect. He wanted the place to remain beautiful and dignified for anyone who came to visit. By midday, visitors started arriving. Some came with flowers in hand, while others carried cameras to capture the old stone carvings. Marcus kept a watchful but gentle eye on everyone. He did not like to interfere unless he had to, but he believed in keeping order. He often reminded himself that respect was something that could not always be taught, it had to be shown. His presence was his way of teaching. That afternoon, a group of young men appeared at the cemetery gates. They were loud, their voices breaking the calm silence of the place. They walked in with careless steps, laughing among themselves. Marcus noticed them immediately. He could tell they were not here for remembrance or respect. Their body language and careless chatter gave away their attitude. Still, Marcus did not rush to stop them. He believed in giving people a chance to behave correctly before stepping in. The young men wandered among the tombs, pointing at names, making jokes, and laughing loudly. One of them pretended to salute a statue of a soldier while the others burst into laughter. To Marcus, it was a painful sight. He stood at a distance, watching quietly. His heart felt heavy, but he kept his calm. He reminded himself that reacting too quickly might only make things worse. After a while, the group grew bolder. One boy leaned against a tomb, tapping it as though it were nothing more than a piece of stone. Another picked up some flowers left by a family and twirled them around as though they were toys. Marcus clenched his hands behind his back. He had seen careless behavior before, but what he saw now was more than that, it was mockery. Still, he remained patient. He wanted to see if they would realize their mistake on their own. Minutes passed, and the young men only grew louder. They began taking pictures, posing in silly ways beside the tombs, even making faces. To them, the cemetery was not sacred ground, it was just another place to amuse themselves. Marcus shook his head slightly. He wondered if they understood how much sacrifice lay under their feet. Probably not. Perhaps no one had ever explained it to them. As the group moved deeper into the cemetery, Marcus followed from a distance. His steps were steady, his expression unreadable. He was trained to stay calm, no matter the situation. But inside, his heart was growing heavier with each act of disrespect he witnessed. The soldiers buried here had given everything, and now their resting place was being turned into a stage for jokes. At one point, the young men began throwing pebbles at a row of headstones, laughing each time they hit one. The sound of the small stones striking the graves echoed harshly in the still air. Marcus stopped walking for a moment, standing tall and firm. His eyes fixed on them, and though they did not notice, he was preparing himself. If they continued, he would step in. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, almost as if nature itself disapproved of what was happening. Marcus drew a deep breath, trying to steady the emotions rising within him. He thought about the families who had come here with tears in their eyes, carrying flowers for loved ones who never returned home. He thought about his grandfather, whose memory lived strongly in him. The thought of anyone mocking such sacrifices was difficult to bear. The group then gathered around one particular tomb. It was well decorated, with fresh flowers placed neatly on it and a small flag standing upright beside the stone. Instead of respecting it, the young men began joking about the name written on it. One of them even pretended to bow in mock seriousness, while the others laughed loudly. Marcus felt his patience thin. He could no longer see this as harmless foolishness. It had turned into open disrespect. Still, Marcus waited a moment longer. He wanted to be sure they had no intention of correcting themselves. He gave them space, hoping one of them would stop the others, but that hope quickly faded. Their laughter grew louder, echoing in the air that should have been filled with silence and respect. Finally, one of the young men did something Marcus could not ignore. He placed his foot against the tomb and pushed, leaning his full weight onto the stone. The flag beside it toppled to the ground, and the flowers scattered across the path. The others cheered him on, clapping and laughing. That was the moment Marcus knew he could not stay in the shadows any longer. With calm but determined steps, Marcus began walking toward them. His tall figure and steady movement made him look almost like part of the cemetery itself, a guardian rising to protect what had been disrespected. The group was so busy laughing that they did not notice him at first. Each step he took was heavy with purpose. His uniform caught the light of the sun, and his shadow stretched long across the path. As he came closer, his heart beat with controlled strength. He was not angry in the way most people understood anger. His feelings were deeper, shaped by years of discipline and respect. He did not want to shout or act with force. He wanted to show them that this was not a playground, but a place of honor. By the time Marcus was only a few steps away, one of the boys finally noticed him. His laughter faded into silence, and he nudged the others. Slowly, their noise died down as they all turned to see the tall guard standing before them. His face was calm, but his eyes carried a seriousness that none of them could ignore. In that moment, the atmosphere of the cemetery shifted. The laughter that had filled the air vanished, replaced by silence so deep that the sound of the wind seemed louder than before. The young men exchanged uneasy looks, unsure of what to do. For the first time since entering, they seemed to realize that they were being watched not just by Marcus, but by the silent rows of tombstones around them. Marcus stopped just a few feet away, standing firm. His presence alone spoke louder than any words. The boys, who had been so full of confidence minutes earlier, now shuffled awkwardly, their laughter replaced with uncertainty. Marcus did not speak yet. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the moment to sink into their minds. Inside, Marcus reminded himself of his duty. He was here to protect, not to fight. He was here to teach, not to humiliate. And so, with steady breath, he prepared to do what was necessary, not with anger, but with the same calm respect that had guided him every day of his service. The group of young men stood frozen, their earlier laughter still hanging faintly in the air like smoke after a fire. Marcus stood a few feet away from them, tall and steady, his face calm but his presence strong enough to silence the entire group. None of them dared to speak first. They shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other, some staring down at the ground, as if unsure what to do with their hands or their voices. Marcus did not rush. He allowed the silence to linger, knowing it was more powerful than any quick words could be. He wanted them to feel the weight of the moment, to understand that what they had been doing was not just childish mischief, it was something deeper, something that touched the heart of respect and honor. Finally, Marcus stepped closer. His boots pressed against the gravel path, each sound clear and steady. When he spoke, his voice was calm, yet it carried a firmness that left no room for jokes. "Do you know where you are standing?" he asked. His words were not loud, but they were sharp enough to cut through the uneasy silence. The boys exchanged glances. One of them tried to shrug, pretending to be casual, but his voice wavered when he answered. "It's just a cemetery, right?" Marcus's eyes held steady on him. "Not just a cemetery," he replied. "This ground holds the bodies of men who gave their lives in service. Every stone here represents someone who once walked, breathed, and sacrificed everything so that others could live in freedom. And you have been treating it like a playground." His words landed heavily. The boys looked around at the rows of stones, but this time their laughter was gone. They saw the same sights as before, but now the meaning behind them began to grow clearer. The flag they had knocked over lay on the ground between them, and the flowers were still scattered, silent witnesses to their actions. One of the boys cleared his throat nervously. "We were just messing around. Didn't mean anything by it." Marcus stepped closer still, his expression calm but unyielding. "Messing around," he repeated slowly. "Do you think the families who come here with tears in their eyes would see it that way? Do you think the mother who left those flowers would believe her child's sacrifice deserves to be laughed at?" The boy dropped his gaze, unable to answer. None of them spoke. The weight of Marcus's words pressed down heavier than any lecture they had ever received. Marcus bent down slowly and picked up the small flag from the ground. He brushed off the dirt gently, holding it with care, and then placed it back into the soil beside the tomb. He straightened the flowers too, his movements precise, almost ritual-like. The boys watched in silence, their earlier arrogance melting away as they realized just how much respect he gave even to the smallest symbols of remembrance. When Marcus stood tall again, he looked at them with eyes that were not filled with anger, but with something deeper: disappointment. "This is sacred ground," he said quietly. "And whether you meant it or not, your actions brought disrespect here. It's not just about what you did, it's about what it means." For a moment, no one moved. The boys shifted uneasily, each of them carrying the weight of guilt in his own way. One of them finally muttered, "We didn't think about it like that." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's the problem. Too many people don't think about it. They walk through life forgetting the price others paid. But forgetting is dangerous. Disrespect is dangerous. Because when memory fades, so does gratitude." The words struck the boys with surprising force. They had expected perhaps a scolding or a warning, maybe even to be thrown out, but what they received instead was something heavier: truth. The tallest boy, who had been the loudest earlier, finally spoke up, his voice low. We're sorry." Marcus studied him for a moment. He could see that the apology was not just spoken out of fear, but from a growing awareness of their mistake. He gave a single nod, acknowledging it, but he did not let the moment slip by too quickly. "Sorry is a beginning," Marcus said, "but it cannot undo what you have already done. What matters now is what you choose to do next. Will you walk away unchanged, or will you carry this lesson with you? The group stood quietly, the wind moving gently through the trees above them. For the first time since entering the cemetery, their posture had changed. Their shoulders were lower, their eyes less wild, their energy subdued. It was as though the place itself, through Marcus's voice, had reminded them of something they had forgotten: respect. Marcus stepped back slightly, giving them space to think. He did not lecture further. He knew silence could teach as much as words. The boys lingered by the tomb for several long minutes, their earlier smirks gone. Finally, one of them bent down and began gathering the flowers that had fallen. He placed them carefully back at the base of the stone, arranging them as best he could. Another straightened the dirt where the flag had been planted. The others stood nearby, awkward but quieter, no longer laughing. Marcus watched them without a word. Deep down, he hoped this small action marked a beginning for them, a shift in how they saw the world. Sometimes people only needed a single strong moment to change their perspective, and this might have been theirs. When they finally turned to leave, Marcus walked with them toward the gate. His presence remained steady, not threatening but firm. They glanced back once more at the rows of stones as they walked away, and Marcus could tell the place no longer looked the same to them. As the gates closed behind them, Marcus stood quietly for a while. The air around him was still, the quiet returning as though nothing had happened. But Marcus knew something had happened. Something important. He had faced the breaking point not just of his patience, but of their thoughtlessness. And in that breaking point, something new had been built, a seed of understanding. He walked back to the tomb where the flag now stood tall again and the flowers were gently placed. He stood there for a long time, gazing at the stone, feeling the quiet strength that always came to him in these moments. He whispered softly, "They will learn. They must learn." And though the night would come, and more days would follow, Marcus carried with him the certainty that what had happened that afternoon was not just a confrontation, but the beginning of a change for those boys, and perhaps for many others who would hear the story one day. The sun was setting slowly, spreading a soft golden light across the cemetery. The air was cooler now, and the silence of the place returned after the noise and disrespect that had filled it earlier. Marcus walked slowly back along the rows of graves, his heart steady but thoughtful. He had faced situations before: curious visitors, careless children, or tourists who treated the place like a park, but this incident had been different. This time, the disrespect had been louder, sharper, more deliberate. And yet, he had faced it without anger, relying on calm words and presence to make the young men see the truth of what they had done. As he walked, Marcus thought about the way their expressions had changed. At first, their faces had been full of laughter and arrogance, but by the end, there was shame, even reflection, in their eyes. That was something he held onto. He believed people could change, especially when they were young. Mistakes, though painful, could become lessons that shaped lives. Later that evening, Marcus sat on a bench near the cemetery gates. He often stayed a little after hours, not because it was required, but because he felt a personal duty. The world outside the gates was fast and noisy, but inside, he found peace. He sat quietly, remembering the words he had spoken and the silence that had followed. He wondered what the boys were thinking now as they went home. Would they talk about it among themselves? Would they laugh it off to hide their embarrassment, or would they remember the seriousness of his voice? Marcus hoped they would carry the memory forward. He knew he could not force anyone to change. True respect had to grow from within. But he also knew that sometimes one encounter could stay in someone's mind for years, returning to them when they least expected it. The next day, Marcus began his morning as usual. He checked the paths, greeted a few visitors, and made sure the grounds remained in order. Yet, his mind kept returning to what had happened. He could not help but replay the moment when one of the boys had pushed against the tomb and knocked over the flag. That image stayed with him. He reminded himself that he had done what was right, but he also felt a deep sense of responsibility. Protecting the cemetery was not only about stopping disrespect, it was also about preventing it. Later in the afternoon, a small group of veterans arrived. They moved slowly, their steps heavy but proud. Marcus greeted them with a respectful nod, and they returned the gesture. He watched as they made their way to certain graves, standing in silence, some saluting, some lowering their heads in quiet prayer. Marcus felt comforted by their presence. They understood better than anyone what these stones meant. One of the veterans approached Marcus on his way out. The man had grey hair and eyes that carried stories untold. "You keep this place safe," the veteran said softly. "It shows." Marcus bowed his head slightly. "I do what I can, sir. They deserve nothing less." The veteran placed a hand on his shoulder. "And you're right about that." With that, the man walked away, leaving Marcus with a quiet strength in his chest. The following evening, something unexpected happened. As Marcus was making his rounds, he noticed movement near the gate. To his surprise, it was the same group of boys from the day before. They were quieter this time, their steps slower. They carried no loud laughter, no careless attitude. One of them held a small bunch of flowers, another carried a small flag. Marcus watched them from a distance as they walked toward the same tomb they had disrespected. He did not interrupt. He stood silently, letting them do what they had come to do. The boys stopped at the tomb, and for a long while, none of them spoke. The boy holding the flowers bent down and placed them gently at the base of the stone. The one with the flag planted it carefully back into the ground, straightening it until it stood upright. The others stood with bowed heads, awkward at first but slowly settling into the silence. Marcus felt a quiet sense of relief wash over him. They had returned, not because they were forced, but because something inside them had changed. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps reflection, but whatever it was, it had brought them back. That, to Marcus, was enough. After a few minutes, the boys noticed him standing nearby. One of them stepped forward, his voice hesitant but sincere. "We wanted to say, we're sorry. We didn't understand before. But we do now." Marcus nodded, his face calm but his eyes softening. "Understanding is the first step," he said gently. "Remember this feeling. Carry it with you. Respect doesn't stop at these gates, it belongs in every part of life." The boys nodded quietly, and then they left the cemetery, walking more thoughtfully than when they had first entered. Marcus stood still for a while, watching them disappear down the road, his heart lighter. He knew not every young person who made mistakes would correct themselves, but these boys had taken a step in the right direction. That night, Marcus wrote in his small notebook, something he did often. It was a simple record of events at the cemetery, but sometimes it became more than that, it became a place for his thoughts. He wrote about the boys, about their disrespect, and about their return. He wrote about how people often did not understand the value of something until they were shown. His handwriting was steady, his words simple but meaningful. Days passed, and life at the cemetery returned to its usual rhythm. Visitors came and went, families brought flowers, children asked questions, and Marcus remained the watchful presence among the stones. But the memory of those boys stayed with him. He found himself more determined than ever to protect the dignity of the place, not just by guarding it, but by teaching respect whenever he could. One afternoon, a teacher brought a group of students to the cemetery. Marcus was asked to speak to them about the importance of honoring those who had served. He stood before them, calm and steady, and told them about sacrifice, about memory, and about respect. He did not mention the boys directly, but the story of what had happened lived in his words. The children listened carefully, their young faces serious, and Marcus knew that even if only a few of them truly remembered, it would still matter. Each evening, as Marcus walked his final round, he carried with him the belief that respect was not something that could be demanded, it had to be earned, taught, and felt. The confrontation with the boys had reminded him of this truth. His role was not just to protect the graves physically, but to protect the meaning behind them. The cemetery stood tall, its stones glowing softly in the moonlight, and Marcus whispered the same quiet promise he always did, "As long as I'm here, you will not be forgotten." The days moved forward, and the rhythm of life at the cemetery continued as it always had. The trees swayed in the wind, the flowers came and went with the seasons, and the stones stood silently, carrying the names of those who had once lived and sacrificed. Marcus carried on with his duty, walking the paths every morning and evening, checking each corner, and watching over the sacred ground with the same quiet dedication that had guided him for years. But inside him, something had shifted. The incident with the boys was still fresh in his memory. It had tested his patience, his discipline, and his sense of purpose. It had shown him how quickly respect could be lost, but also how it could be restored when someone was willing to guide others. Each time Marcus thought about the way the boys had returned with flowers and a flag, he felt a deep sense of reassurance. It reminded him that even the most careless hearts could learn when given the chance. One morning, Marcus was walking his usual route when he noticed a small card tucked into the corner of the very same soldier's tomb that had been disrespected weeks earlier. Curious, he leaned closer and read the message. It was written in uneven handwriting, but the words were clear: "Thank you for your service. We are sorry for what we did. We will never forget." Marcus stood there for a long moment, holding the card gently in his hand. He did not need to know who had written it. He could guess. It was enough to know that the boys had not simply walked away and forgotten. They had returned once more, not to make a show, but to leave behind a quiet promise. Marcus placed the card back where he found it, smoothing it carefully so the wind would not carry it away. His heart felt lighter than it had in days. As the weeks passed, more people began to hear about what had happened. One of the cemetery staff members who had seen the boys return shared the story quietly with others. Soon, families who visited began asking Marcus about it, curious to know how he had handled such disrespect. Marcus always spoke humbly. He never exaggerated or raised himself higher. He simply explained that he had reminded the boys of the meaning of sacrifice, and they had listened. "It was not about me," he would say softly. "It was about them choosing to understand." His humility made the story even stronger. Visitors admired the way he had carried himself, not with anger but with calm dignity. Some began to see Marcus not only as a guard but as a guardian of values, someone who carried the weight of memory for those who could no longer speak for themselves. One afternoon, a reporter from a local paper arrived. He had heard whispers of the story and wanted to speak to Marcus. At first, Marcus hesitated. He did not enjoy attention. He believed his work was best done quietly, without headlines. But the reporter insisted that sharing the story might inspire others, so Marcus finally agreed. They sat together under the shade of a tree as Marcus spoke. He described his daily duties, his grandfather's memory, and the moment he had confronted the boys. His words were simple and honest. The reporter listened carefully, writing notes and asking thoughtful questions. By the time the conversation ended, Marcus hoped only that the message would be clear: respect is not optional, it is necessary. A week later, the story appeared in the newspaper. The headline read, "Cemetery Guard Teaches Lesson in Respect." It was not dramatic, but it captured the truth. The article spread quickly, shared in schools, churches, and community centers. Teachers began using it to speak to students about the importance of respect, and parents mentioned it at dinner tables. Marcus had never imagined his quiet act of discipline would reach so far. Despite the attention, Marcus remained the same. He still arrived early each morning, still walked the paths with steady steps, still whispered his quiet promise to the stones each night. Fame did not matter to him. What mattered was the meaning behind the story, the hope that more people would understand the sacredness of the cemetery, the value of remembrance, and the weight of sacrifice. Months later, the same group of boys returned once again, but this time they were not alone. They brought with them a few of their friends. They walked more respectfully than before, carrying flowers in their hands. They visited several tombs, placing flowers carefully, and then stood silently for a while. Marcus watched from a distance, his heart swelling with quiet pride. Change was never instant, but here it was slow, steady, and real. One of the boys approached Marcus afterward. He was the tallest of the group, the one who had been the loudest in the beginning. His voice was steady now, more mature than Marcus remembered. "We've been telling others about what happened," he said. "We didn't realize how serious it was until that day. We want people our age to understand. We want them to know what this place means." Marcus nodded, his expression calm but approving. "That is how respect grows," he said gently. "Not by keeping it to yourself, but by sharing it." The boy smiled faintly, and then he and his friends walked away, leaving behind the flowers they had brought. Marcus stood tall, watching them go, knowing they were no longer the same boys who had once laughed among the tombs. They had become young men who carried a new sense of responsibility. Seasons changed. The trees shed their leaves, the air grew colder, and then spring returned with fresh blossoms. Life outside the cemetery moved on, as it always did, but inside those gates, the sense of honor remained unshaken. Marcus continued his work year after year, always steady, always faithful. The story of the boys faded into the background, but its lesson lived on in the people who had heard it. Sometimes, when new groups of children or young people visited, Marcus would share a gentle version of the story, not to embarrass anyone, but to teach. He spoke not with anger but with patience, showing them that mistakes could be corrected, that respect could be learned. Each time he told the story, the listeners grew quiet, their laughter fading as they understood the seriousness of his words. Marcus never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as a servant, a man fulfilling his duty. But in the quiet corners of the cemetery, where only the wind and the trees could hear, he often thought about his grandfather. He imagined the old man standing proudly, smiling at the way his grandson had carried forward the values he once lived by. That thought gave Marcus all the strength he needed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of red and gold, Marcus finished his final round. He stopped once more at the soldier's tomb where the story had begun, placing his hand gently on the stone. His voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of his heart. "Your sacrifice is not forgotten," he said. "And as long as I'm here, it never will be." The wind rustled through the trees as if answering his promise. Marcus stood tall, his shadow stretching long across the path, a guardian not only of the graves but of the values they represented. And though the world outside would always be noisy, hurried, and sometimes careless, within these gates respect remained alive because one man had chosen to stand firm, to speak with dignity, and to remind others of the truth that sacrifice deserves honor.